Well, look, China seeks to become the Middle Kingdom again after what they would suggest 200 years of humiliation, and they are on the march under President Xi, certainly since 2013, militarily, diplomatically, financially, and I think they're very reputation dependent. And I would argue that reputation is in tatters in each of those areas.
To get Brexit.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
This is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing French Hill. French Hill is a US Congressman, he is a Republican, he worked for the George H.W. Bush administration as an economic advisor for some years and then was a banker. We're going to be talking about the West's relationship with China in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic and the events going on in Hong Kong. We're also going to be talking about how the US economy can recover from COVID-19. So I hope you enjoy this video. So thank you so much for joining us, Congressman.
Glad to be with you. Thanks, Stephen.
Did China mishandle the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think so, based on what we know. I think there's more to be learned by what truly happened in the fall last year, leading into December's apparent public first case around the second week of December. But there's a lot, I think, the rest of the world wants to know about what China knew, when they knew it, and when they knew it was going to be a significant problem, and disclose that to the World Health Organization and to countries all over the world.
Do you think they covered up the pandemic from the beginning?
The evidence that we've seen thus far would indicate that they did. They were not forthcoming as quickly as they might have been, and I think they put a lot of people at risk, including their own citizens, as they prepared for the holidays of the Chinese New Year. They're facilitating millions of Chinese citizens who are from infected areas to travel throughout the country, exacerbating their own challenge, not just the challenge to the world.
And based on all that, how should the US respond?
I think the U.S. should respond with our allies and demand accountability for what happened in China, what could have been improved there. And also, as you know, President Trump has proposed withholding American funding for our share of the support of the World Health Organization until we get to the bottom of China's relationship with the World Health Organization and how potentially they influenced the WHO for not being forthcoming sooner, even potentially a month sooner than we began hearing from the WHO. I recall distinctly their tweet from mid-January, I think the 14th or so of January, where the WHO said, oh, this is contained in the Wuhan province in China, and it's not communicable between humans or something to that effect. I mean, just clearly misinformation that public health officials are counting on around the world.
What do you think is behind the motivation of China for doing the things that you say that they've done in relation to this pandemic?
Well, look, China seeks to become the Middle Kingdom again after what they would suggest 200 years of humiliation, and they are on the march under President Xi, certainly since 2013, militarily, diplomatically, financially, developing country finance-wise, trade policy, and in social policy, whether it's the changes they've made in religious freedom and religious tolerance in the country. And I think they're very reputation dependent. And I would argue that reputation is in tatters in each of those areas, whether we're talking about South China defense policy, their embarrassing handling of and violating their 50-year arrangement with the United Kingdom on Hong Kong, their taking of territory that belongs to other countries in the South China Sea region, from Vietnam to the Philippines to Japan. And obviously, for 25 years, their reputation in trade is in tatters, as they say they're going to protect intellectual property of companies doing business in China, then they turn right around and commit one act of piracy after another, despite assurances to the contrary. And we could carry on that discussion into other areas as well. So I think it's reputation protection, Stephen, is what drives the Communist Party at the top in Beijing to try to position themselves. They can do that in their own country, controlling propaganda, controlling media, controlling the internet. But look, everyone outside China knows the facts.
You mentioned Hong Kong there. I think yesterday Mike Pompeo released a statement saying that Hong Kong is no longer an autonomous region from China. How can the US and its allies protect the people of Hong Kong, help the people of Hong Kong?
Well, the House of Representatives here in the United States and the Senate have been very outspoken, passing many resolutions in support of the people of Hong Kong, and specifically, look, honoring the agreement between the United Kingdom and the PRC should be honored. One country, two systems, but China is now reneging on the 5-decade deal they made with the United Kingdom to have Hong Kong returned to China and end its colonial status. And they are, in my view, going to suffer the consequences of, again, reputational risk. Who wants to do business with China when they treat their own people like this? We passed a resolution just yesterday censuring China on their treatment of the Uyghurs and giving the president authority to impose sanctions. So when you see how China treats their own citizens, in whether it's the pandemic impact or religious freedom or freedom of movement or the use of the internet for direct spying, why would you want to do business with them? Why do you want to borrow money from them in Africa? Why do you want them to be your development aid partner? Why do you want to have them as an economic partner? So I would say they're not trustworthy, and that we need to work with the G7 countries and work to pressure China to honor its 50-year commitment to the people of Hong Kong. This is just going to reduce China's standing in the world in one more way. And I'm terribly concerned about it. And I'm terribly concerned for the people of Hong Kong that have been the most enterprising and successful place in the world since the 1830s. One of my favorite expressions was, how many more Hong Kongs can the world stand? And this was from back in the 60s and the 70s. And the response was, as many as the world will allow, because it's so enterprising and freedom loving. And now we see the Chinese Communist Party destroying that 200-year history.
Well, I suppose it's an interesting question, and perhaps I could turn that around on you now and say, how many more of these Hong Kong situations can the world stand, in that China continuing to reach out its power, continuing to take away power from the Hong Kongers by imposing its security laws, China continuing to grow its influence in that region and all around the world. When do we say enough is enough, and we actually need to get even more tough with China? It's not just rhetoric, it's not just passing resolutions in support of the Hong Kong people, but going even further than that.
Well, Stephen, it's a good point. And during the 3 years of the Trump administration, I've watched with great interest our friends in the UK, our friends in Japan, in the European Union. Will they stand with the United States on changing trade policy in China publicly? And the answer is, we got your back. We're for you, but we need the G7 countries to unify on things like demanding trade policies that are fair. If China wants to be all these things that China claims it wants to be, a part of the family of nations, an economic leader, a leader of stability in the North Asia and South Asia sphere of influence, a development partner for Africa and poor countries, then it needs to act like a member of the family of nations. Follow the Paris Club on sovereign debt creditor standards. The House passed my bill just a few weeks ago, unanimously. There were no dissenting votes, to direct the Treasury Department of the United States to have its vote at the World Bank and the IMF demand before you lend money to China or lend money in the developing world or do an exchange stabilization action at the IMF, we want transparency from the Chinese on any sovereign lending that they've extended to the developing world. They are the largest creditor now in the developing world. But America, while we are a large country and we have a large voice in the international financial institutions, we need our friends and our allies to join us in demanding transparency and exposing the debt trap that China is creating in the developing world, whether it's in Africa or other impoverished countries. Expose, don't just complain about intellectual property theft or the dangers of 5G deployment. Join us in compelling change because together we can do that. U.S., Japan, the European Union, including the United Kingdom, are more than a third of two-way trade with China. That's an economic stick that the communist mandarins in Beijing will understand. But so you raise such a good point, and I would argue that America's been a good voice. America has passed good resolutions. America stands ready to help compel change that will benefit the whole world, but we really can't do that alone. So this is I'm delivering the message not only to my friends across the pond, but also as we work in multilateral arrangements, I'm delivering that message to our own leadership here in Washington. Let's make sure that we are getting our allies on the same page with us and that they publicly support this kind of change in China.
There's a lot to unpack there, and I'm really interested in your ideas about the way the UK and the EU specifically have responded to this pandemic, and also have, our China policy in Britain specifically over the last 10 years, let's say, has been pretty much cozying up to the Chinese regime in a lot of ways. George Osborne, our former Chancellor, talked about the golden era of Sino-British relations. And finally, I think Boris Johnson is beginning to take a different line on that. He recently approved the Huawei decision to allow Huawei to invest in our 5G infrastructure. Do you think that Britain and the European Union have been weak on China? And if so, and do you think that we've been cozying up to China? And if so, do you think part of that is because basically that we have a lot of dollar signs or pound signs in our eyes, and we see a lot of investment opportunities, and we don't actually necessarily think that doing the right thing, i.e., all the information that we have about this pandemic and previous atrocities that China has been involved with, do you think that we simply are seeing pound signs in our eyes and not wanting to actually follow the American way of being a bit more tough on China?
Well, I believe that since the 1990s, post Tiananmen Square, that the G7 leaders believed that China was going to move towards market capitalism and that it would come along with a little bit more, I'd say, pluralistic or tolerant approach to freedoms in the country, not democracy, but more tolerant of religion, more tolerant of speech, and that they would come our way. And this was wishful thinking, but time takes history takes a long time to develop, and China has a long time horizon. But it was clear by the teens during the Obama administration that for all the reasons you and I have just discussed in each area, military, diplomatic, developing, world health, climate, etc., that China was going to take a different course, become more authoritarian, more demanding in the country, and try to use its influence of 25 or 30 years of opening, where it's fully integrated into the European economies, the American economy, as leverage to say, no, we're going to run our country the way we want to. We're going to say that we control the seas and control anything we want in Asia. And you can't do much about it because you're dependent on our capital or you're dependent on our trade relations. The ultimate penalty here is, I think that was a mistake on the part of the Chinese Communist Party. And have people cozied up? Yes. Over that 3-decade period, they did, because they thought they were doing the right thing to press China into changing market economics and, I'd say, a more pluralistic life at home. It's not working. They want an authoritative communist. I know this is ironic. It's really an authoritarian state with a communist Politburo head that is using market capitalism as a tool against the rest of the world, effectively. And so I think policymakers from Germany to London to Washington are pivoting. Some have pivoted faster than others. But I believe that we will have more strength to compel our foreign policy goals and our economic policy goals if Brussels, London, and Washington are on the same page here. And I'm not excluding our friends in Seoul and Tokyo and other countries in the world who I think share this view. So the fact that they're going to be the great helper in the world, I think, has been uncovered, not just by the pandemic, but by the debt traps since 2013 through the One Belt, One Road. And recently here in America, I don't know how it is in the United Kingdom, recently here in America, we are now arresting academics on our college and university campuses on a regular basis for intellectual property theft, including national security level information, through the Chinese 1,000 Talents program. I call it the 1,000 Thieves program, whereby they are paying mostly American professors on the side, tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars, for access to American research. Is that what, a family of nations leading economic and foreign policy country does? Certainly not.
Recently, let's talk about the specific response from the EU and the UK to this pandemic and to the events in Hong Kong. Obviously, Britain hasn't put out a statement, not to my knowledge yet, about the affairs in Hong Kong, or at least it hasn't supported Mike Pompeo's assessment that Hong Kong is no longer an autonomous region. Britain and the European Union have also not followed America's decision to pull funding from the World Health Organization, which many have accused of being too close to China. Do you think that is weakness on the part of Britain and the EU?
Well, I would certainly urge the United Kingdom and leaders in Brussels to have a critical eye towards the World Health Organization and ask for the assessment of what happened between the autumn and January and the influence of China over the organization. And so it's important, whether they reduce funding or not. I think they need to step up and demand the accountability that's essential here. On the subject of Hong Kong, I, in recent days, have talked to Martin Lee, Cardinal Zen, the former Catholic Cardinal for Southeast Asia, and I have really monitored that situation closely. I saw former Governor Sir Chris Patton's letter. I would urge the United Kingdom to enlist our help in pressing China to do one thing: honor their international agreement between the United Kingdom and the People's Republic of China. There are 27 years to go. Respect the rights of one country, two systems that was put in place. And I would say to my friends in the Houses of Parliament, America is prepared to help. And we know this is a bilateral relationship of critical importance and historic importance to the people of the United Kingdom. But we are so disappointed by what's happened in Beijing that Secretary Pompeo took the action that he did yesterday. He said without pleasure, but hopefully that will send a message to Beijing.
Now, you mentioned before an interesting event in that Tiananmen Square, which was obviously a massacre against students protesting against the regime in Beijing in 1989. And in 1989, you were advising the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, on economic policy. You did that throughout the 1990s. Did you see then any kind of warning signs? I mean, did you take Tiananmen Square, for example, as a warning sign that actually China isn't going to go down a more democratic path, and that in fact China is still in the era of Mao in one sense, in that they have this kind of brutal communist dictatorship willing to murder thousands and thousands of protesters?
Well, I did. I actually, after I left my service with President Bush in the mid '90s, I wrote a long column about Bill Clinton's foreign policy, bilateral relations with China, and the summation of that piece was much is demanded of a country who says they want to be a part of the family of nations. And the key point was they have to live with the consequences of not following the rules. So we have a cartoon strip in the United States called Peanuts by Charles Schulz. And frequently Lucy holds the football for Charlie Brown and invites Charlie Brown to kick the football through the goals. And he runs up ahead of steam and charges to kick the football. She pulls it away. And I would argue that America has never pulled the ball away from China. They were admitted to the World Trade Organization. They are still a borrower at the World Bank under preferential terms. They have been, as you say, cozied up to economically from a supply chain point of view. Like, don't worry, it's all going to work out. They're going to become real partners in global affairs. And in each instance, we let them kick the field goal, but they didn't pay any price for piracy. And in the Clinton administration, they signed 3 agreements on intellectual property, following up on George H.W. Bush, my boss's first intellectual property agreement before he left office in January 1993. And Mickey Cantor and others in the trade areas of President Clinton did that. And the piracy just doubled down. So I think that my point was, whether it's the 1990s or today, China has to pay a price for not following the rules that the family of nations has outlined, whether we're talking about open seas in the South China Sea for maritime commerce. This is not their territorial waters. Or stealing intellectual property or spying on people. So I'm not trying to get on a high horse here. I'm setting a low bar. I'm simply saying that if they want to be this great leader in economics and trade and national security and peace and prosperity and development, they ought to play by the rules. Join the Paris Club. I think the United Kingdom and Europe should join with the United States to demand that China as a creditor should follow the Paris Club rules and join the Paris Club, which is how creditors resolve sovereign debt concerns. They're not a member.
Are you worried that part of the reason your allies and America's allies in Britain and the European Union haven't followed America's more hawkish or tough line on China is because of Donald Trump's rhetoric, is because of this whole idea of America first? Do you think that has caused America to become more isolated on the world stage?
Well, that is alleged. And yet I know Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mnuchin and Ambassador Lighthizer, our trade envoy, how capable they are and how hard they've worked behind the scenes with our allies to develop consensus on the things that we've talked about today. It's true. Donald Trump is from New York, Queens, New York. He's a brash, tough talking entrepreneur who's now the president of the United States. And that turns people off. I get it. But the policy is still the right policy. And the collaboration between the Western leaders that believe in capital markets, pluralism, religious tolerance of belief, we do need to be bound together and not determine whether we like people's personalities or not. I don't think that the leaders in World War II, the allies in World War II, necessarily got along personality-wise. Winston Churchill stepping out of the bathtub naked, notwithstanding. It shouldn't be about personality. It should be about policy and collaboration on getting the right outcome. So I would urge my friends, we've all worked in situations where we may or may not have truly enjoyed the company of our coworkers or worked for the most fabulous boss in the world. But the mission is important. And so I think this mission of free market capitalism and open trade and holding them to account, just as I urged back in the 1990s, is something that we all have to continue to work toward.
Let's talk about the SAVE Act. This is all about realigning the West's alignment or dependence rather on China and structuring supply chains so as not to be dependent on China. How should, first of all, is this the right policy, and how should the West or countries such as the USA do this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll respond first of all about supply chains. I think private businesses throughout Europe and throughout the United States are, and for that matter, Latin America and elsewhere in Asia, are rethinking their dependence on China. So this issue of diversifying supply chain in the market system is happening, and it's been happening for 3 years. And let's not put all of our eggs in one basket when that basket has now turned out to be a authoritarian dictatorship that's a thief. Wow. That's not what we expected. We thought they would come along. They didn't. In fact, they pivoted and gone the other direction. So that's the most important way to, quote, hold China to account is hurt them economically in that manner, in my view. Now, to the SAVE Act, here in the United States, we have a Defense Production Act that we signed back in the Korean War, which allows us to ramp up production of material that we need for national defense. Over that 70-year period, it's been amended to include national emergencies. It's been expanded beyond just defense material to include energy, for example. So I propose that we amend it to include medical supplies and particularly pharmaceutical supplies, and that we make sure that we have a diverse supply chain that's not dependent on any one country and that can ramp up production in the case of a national emergency. So that's the purpose of the SAVE Act. It's just one step. It's a prospective way of handling that in the United States. When you look at drug manufacturing, it's pretty diversified. About 28% of finished drugs are made here in the US. Probably another 25% are made in the European Union. But there are two big countries that are developing countries that have in manufacturing capacity. In America, our imports from India, about 18%, and China, about 13% of finished drugs. On the medical supply chain, things like gowns, masks, ventilators, devices, it is very dependent over in China. Also, and maybe most importantly, the active ingredients, the strategic active ingredients that go into pharmaceuticals, China has worked very hard to effectively corner the market in those types of materials. And so if I said, where should we be focused on that diversification first, it would be in that active ingredient area. And we need to work on that in the U.S. And I would say that's an issue for the international drug manufacturing industry, period. We've become too dependent on China for those active ingredients. Let me give you two examples. Before World War I, America was very dependent on the active chemical ingredients on the German chemical industry. And we were unprepared when war broke out in Europe. Likewise, in the late 1930s, we were very dependent on Japan-controlled territory for rubber, which led to the concept of innovating and creating synthetic rubber. So we should always be thinking ahead about supply chain diversification in our integrated world. Now, not just because of conflict, like war breaking out, but because of economic clout and this issue of pandemic, health issues, or a cyber attack, or someone bringing down the electrical grid somewhere in the world. So diversification is an important step to anyone's national defense. So I think that's an important issue for the European continent to consider, as well as the United States.
Just a few more points on China, and then I want to move on to how the US economy should recover from coronavirus. First of all, there's this idea that Australia is actually pushing, and a few other Western countries, that we should start forming a kind of trading club, as it were, that would divert resources away from dependence on China and depending on each other rather than on Beijing. Do you support this kind of idea? I think they're calling it the D10 countries of the G7 countries plus a few others, Australia included. So we can basically create this sort of global supply chain that diverts away from China.
Well, I think you're seeing that happen. I think it's an interesting concept. I believe that the private sector is already well aware of the risks of supply chain concentration and is doing the analysis of price versus volume versus delivery and in this integrated world. So I anticipate that will accelerate. And if countries come together to share strategies, share ideas on how to promote that, I think that could be a positive thing. But I really believe that the free market capitalist system is already working quickly to reduce the threat of being too dependent in any one place. Again, as I said, economic risk, cyber risk, health risk, and then one of the oldest risks in the world, which is changing government or lack of governmental stability in an area.
Are you worried about Chinese influence leading up to the 2020 election?
In the United States, not more than I am about any other actor that attempts to influence. We've always had, in the Cold War period, terrific efforts by the former Soviet Union to influence elections and policy in the United States. The connectivity now of the World Wide Web and social media platforms has opened up a disinformation campaign strategy to lots of state and non-state actors. So I am interference agnostic in the sense that we want to monitor and work to block, catch, prosecute any state or non-state actor that attempts to skew or influence in the American election system. You know, one benefit we have, Stephen, is that our elections are in 50 different states. They are handled differently in all 50 states. They use different technology and different voting styles in all 50 states. And that really weakens the ability of a state or non-state actor to manipulate outcomes here. So most of it that we've noted and that's been talked about and that we've attempted prosecutions on are just good old-fashioned propaganda, trying to get one group to think one idea or the other. And I think Americans have wised up to some of the nonsense that's out on social media and some of the malicious material that's out on social media.
And finally, on China, does it concern you the rhetoric coming out of Beijing that they are going to go after specific US politicians who have been critical of China? And I think it's fair to say you've been pretty critical of China in this interview. So does that concern you? Does that worry you, the kind of any kind of backlash that you might specifically get from China for being critical towards them?
Well, we've seen that firsthand. I was at a meeting last year in Europe, and I was attending a meeting where Martin Lee was to be a speaker. And I can assure you, the embassy, Chinese embassy in that country, worked incredibly hard to shut that meeting down and stop people from attending and muffle the voices and the views shared at that meeting. So I think everyone is used to their heavy-handed, clumsy approaches to stifling voices around the world. But as I say, the emperor has no clothes. The past 7 years or so of this pivot that President Xi's made to consolidate power as an authoritarian dictator at the head of a communist Politburo is now an open book. I think people see the One Belt, One Road for what it is.
Just on that last point, have you experienced personally any pushback from China? I mean, have you had loads of phishing emails? We've seen this for UK politicians recently. They think that they've been hacked by or been attempted to be hacked by Chinese phishing emails and things like that. Have you experienced any of that recently?
Well, I'd say the Sergeant at Arms here in the House of Representatives has issued warnings to members of Congress that the Chinese are doing their best to, I would say, monitor members' activities. Secretary Pompeo gave, I thought, and I know people overuse the adjective unprecedented, but he gave a really surprising talk earlier this year to all the governors of the United States, warning them about China's strategy in the U.S., including on our university campuses, which we talked about, use of economic development site locations and the things of that nature. So I believe leadership in the U.S. is cognizant of what the Chinese communists are up to, and we are sensitive about it.
So sorry, have you experienced anything that you can point to say actually they've been snooping on me or they've been trying to sort of hack me or in any way?
No, not that I have noticed, but I cite that warning to all members that's been clearly delivered by those here in Washington.
Yeah. Okay, let's finish by talking about the American economic response to coronavirus. You've recently been appointed to the Congressional Oversight Committee, which, in my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is basically a committee overseeing $500 billion worth of funding to help the American economy recover from coronavirus. What do you think should be the strategy to help America recover from this terrible, terrible pandemic?
Well, you're right. The Oversight Commission is one of several accountability measures the Congress put in its big package, the CARES Act, where we appropriated $3 trillion to fight the virus and help preserve our economic ability to get back to full capacity. Stephen, $3 trillion is 60% of what we spend in a whole year's budget. Our whole federal budget annually is about $4.5 trillion, which includes Medicare, Medicaid, building aircraft carriers, running the national parks. I mean, $3 trillion is a lot of money. And in that was $500 billion to go to the U.S. Treasury to work with our Federal Reserve, the central bank, to set up facilities to help businesses get through this liquidity crisis and get back to capacity. They can leverage that $500 billion 10 times, up to 10 times. So potentially the Fed has the ability to spend $5 trillion. So the Oversight Commission is to oversee the Fed and Treasury specifically in their strategies. And right now, what they've done is successfully calm the markets, and both the U.S. High yield bond market and the U.S. high grade bond market have both been functioning well since they took action in mid-March. Spreads have come down. Issuers have been able to get credit, preserve cash, and that's been a very positive thing. The stock market has stabilized. Volatility is down. So the first steps that the Fed and Treasury have taken are solid, and they've been good. I think now comes the hard part. How do you maintain economic affairs just as a liquidity issue and get people back to work in as short a period of time as possible and not lead to a solvency crisis down the road? So we're at the very early stages of that. The Fed has not put out much of that $500 billion at all in both pieces, the March piece and now only say 70 or 80 billion of that thus far. So we're in early days of how we'll get America back to work. And again, for our friends in Europe, this is being done state by state, region by region, and some states will be lightly impacted and get back to work more quickly than others. And our big, dense urban cities will be slower, but they also represent a bigger chunk of what? Our gross domestic product. So this is going to be it's going to be hard work over the next few weeks.
In the UK, we've had the government has instituted or instigated rather a scheme called the furlough scheme, which basically is paying 80% of workers' wages in this during the pandemic. Do you think that? I mean, some people in the US are calling for such a scheme to be implemented over there. Do you think there's any kind of merit to that argument?
Stephen, it's very interesting to see different approaches in different countries. I think we're a little possibly too far down the road now. We did a direct payment, which was a tax rebate to every family. We enhanced our unemployment compensation insurance, including a bonus, to where it annualizes out around $50,000 a year, which is not much in London, but in my home state of Arkansas, the median family income in Arkansas is $27,000. So that unemployment compensation, the personal check, plus we've tried to give money to businesses to keep people employed at their regular pay. That was the secret, or the goal, I should say, not secret, the goal behind the Paycheck Protection Program, where we've put about $500 billion of loans out to small businesses across the country. And we believe over 50 million jobs have been tied to their business and preserved by that PPP program. Whether this approach was right or the UK's approach was right, I don't know. I think every country has to do things a little differently. We may have some sustained challenges in certain industries going forward that we're just now analyzing, as I say, just as we open up, and we may need to tackle other strategies. And that's something Congress is going to be very watchful for, and the Oversight Commission as well.
I want to ask one last question, and it's about the 2008 crisis. Now, you've been a banker for many years. You've obviously advised the Bush administration on economic policy, so you've got a lot of experience in finance. And the response to the 2008 crisis, led by Barack Obama, is widely seen, and you may disagree with this, as being the right one. He spent a lot of money on a stimulus package, and the economy recovered relatively quickly compared to other countries around the world, at least. How does this economic recovery differ from the 2008 financial crisis?
Well, it's an important question, and President Bush and President Obama put those building blocks in place. President Bush passed the first TARP Act. He passed the first assistance to the automobile companies. And then President Obama implemented that as he came into office in January of 2009. It was a huge crisis, but it was caused by more traditional mismanagement of the financial sector by a few financial players, and individual consumers and investors getting carried away. So it was a typical financial crisis. And the government, in applying the rescue package, was also rescuing companies that they were mad at for contributing to the crisis. So here we have a very different situation. We have a global health pandemic that causes the United States to shut down the economy and have almost 40 million people put out of work in a matter of 2 months. So I think it will be a very different approach. We're not mad at anyone. We're trying to get money out as quickly as possible. We're trying to preserve economic activity. We're trying to move that furloughed job to a full-time job and bring them back. And so it's a very different tone, and every economic crisis is different. I've lived through a lot of them since the 1970s when I started in finance, and I appreciate Chairman Jay Powell at our central bank and Secretary Stephen Mnuchin to recognize that they have to be flexible in what they're going to propose to get this economy back. And it won't be the same thing as in 2008, 2009.
On that note, thank you so much for joining us, Congressman Hill.
Thanks, Stephen. Great to be with you. Look forward to seeing you again.
Great. Thank you.